The wind carried a quiet stillness, the kind that only comes after a goodbye Ella May Carter never accepted. In the small, fading town of Dry Creek, Ella sat on her old wooden porch, rocking gently in a chair that had memorized her waiting. For 3 long years, she held on to hope. Every dawn, she brewed coffee for 2. Every sunset, she lit the porch lantern, a small beacon against the encroaching dark, and every night, she whispered a little prayer into the wind, because somewhere out there, Luke Branson, the only man she had ever loved, had disappeared without a single sign. The townsfolk of Dry Creek had long since formed their own conclusions. Some said he'd simply left, chasing a dream bigger than their dusty town. Others speculated he'd gotten lost traveling, a common fate in the unforgiving territories. Most, however, just stopped talking about it altogether. It was easier that way, but Ella never doubted. He ain't the kind to walk away, she'd insist to anyone who still listened. He promised he'd come home. Eventually, people stopped arguing and just let her be, an unchanging figure on the porch as the seasons turned around her. It was the last night of summer. The sky glowed a soft, melancholic orange, the kind of glow that reminds you of everything you miss and everything you still hope for. Ella stepped outside, clutching a faded letter, one Luke had written the night before he disappeared. She read his words aloud, her voice a soft whisper carried on the breeze. "If I don't make it back, just know I never took your love for granted." She closed her eyes, the paper cool against her fingertips. "Luke, wherever you are, find your way home." A warm breeze brushed against her cheek, almost like a reply. Then she heard it. A faint hoofbeat. Slow, unsteady. It was a sound so out of place in the evening silence that for a moment, she thought she'd imagined it. Ella froze, her heart starting to race, a frantic drum against her ribs. Dust swirled down the long, empty road as a tired mustang appeared from the distant haze. But it wasn't he the horse that made her breath catch, it was the man slumped weakly on top of it. A familiar, wide-brimmed hat, a worn denim jacket. A silhouette she knew by heart. "Luke." She whispered, the name of fragile prayer on her lips. The horse stopped at her gate, its head hanging low. Luke lifted his head slowly. He was exhausted, covered in dust, and looked older than she remembered, but his eyes. Those stormy blue eyes, they were still the same. "Ella." He breathed, his voice a dry rasp. She didn't hesitate. She ran from the porch, her feet barely touching the ground, catching him as he slid weakly from the saddle. "You're home," she cried softly, her tears mingling with the dust on his cheek. "You really came home, I told you," he whispered, his consciousness fading. "I'd always find my way back to you." His legs gave out, and she held him tightly, guiding his dead weight toward the porch. But then, Luke's hand gripped hers, not in reunion, but in warning. "Ella, they're following me." Her heart jumped into her throat. Who's following you?" But Luke couldn't answer. His eyes fluttered shut, and he drifted into unconsciousness, his head resting gently against her shoulder. Ella looked out toward the quiet desert road. The porch lantern flickered. The wind held its breath. Somewhere out there, someone else knew Luke had returned, and they were getting closer. The weight of him was immense, but a strength she didn't know she had surged through her. She dragged him up the porch steps and into the house, laying him on the small sofa in the living room. His breathing was shallow, his face pale beneath the grime. She rushed to get a basin of water and a cloth, gently washing the years of hardship from his face. There were new scars she didn't recognize, lines etched around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant fear. Where had he been? What had happened to him? As she cleaned a cut on his forehead, his fingers twitched, and he mumbled something in his sleep, words she couldn't quite make out. Something about a map, and a star. Her mind raced. Luke had been a prospector, always chasing tales of hidden gold and lost mines. Had he finally found something worth being chased for? She went back outside to tend to his horse, a beautiful but exhausted mustang. As she uncinched the saddle, a heavy leather pouch fell to the ground with a dull thud. It was far too heavy to be carrying simple supplies. With trembling hands, she opened the drawstring. Inside, glittering under the pale moonlight, were not rocks, but chunks of raw, unrefined gold ore. Her heart sank. This wasn't just a prospector's lucky find. This was the kind of discovery that got people killed. Now it all made sense. The fear in his eyes, the warning, the unconsciousness brought on by sheer exhaustion and likely injury. He hadn't just been lost, he'd been running. She quickly hid the gold, stashing the pouch deep inside a flour sack in the pantry. Then, she took Luke's rifle from the saddle holster. It felt heavy and cold in her hands. She checked the chamber. It was loaded. For 3 years, she had waited with hope. Now, she would wait with a weapon. The night deepened. The crickets chirped their usual song. But tonight it sounded different. It sounded like a countdown. Every gust of wind made her jump. Every shadow seemed to move. She sat in the rocking chair, the rifle across her lap, her eyes fixed on the dark road leading to her home. She had gotten him back, but the fight, she now realized, was far from over. It had just followed him home. Hours crawled by. The moon climbed higher in the sky. Just as a false sense of security began to settle in, she saw it. Far in the distance, a flicker of light, a lantern, then another, and another. 3 lights, moving slowly but steadily in her direction. They weren't riding fast, they were hunting, taking their time. They knew where he was. Her blood ran cold. This was it. They were here. Dry Creek was a quiet town. Sheriff Miller was old and not one for a gunfight. She was on her own. She looked back at Luke, sleeping soundly, defenseless. He had fought his way back to her. Now, it was her turn to fight for him. She rose from the chair, her movements deliberate and silent. She blew out the porch lantern, plunging the house into darkness. She wouldn't be a sitting target. Let them come into the dark. Let them come into her world. The little house on the edge of town was no longer just a home filled with waiting and memories. Tonight, it was a fortress, and she was its guardian. The hoofbeats were closer now, a rhythmic, menacing sound that promised violence. She cocked the rifle. The click was deafening in the silence. The stillness was over. A new storm was about to break. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss part 2. The old rocking chair groaned softly as Ella eased Luke into it. His breathing was shallow, his body heavy with exhaustion, but the steady rise and fall of his chest was a small, desperate comfort. She gently brushed a layer of dust from his face, her touch lingering on his weathered skin. His clothes were torn and faded, a testament to long days under a harsh sun and nights spent on unforgiving ground. Whatever journey he just finished, it wasn't a simple one. But he was too weak, too fragile for questions. She knew she had to wait. Luke. Stay with me, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. She hurried inside, her worn wooden floors creaking under her feet, and returned with a thick wool blanket and a dipper of cool water. He was still slumped in the chair, caught somewhere between sleep and consciousness, his hand dangling limply at his side. She carefully wrapped the blanket around his tired frame, the familiar fabric a small shield against the coming night. Resting a palm on his cheek, she murmured, "You're safe now. You're home." But even in his half-conscious state, she saw a shadow in his eyes, a flicker of something unspoken. Something was chasing him, something from far beyond the quiet borders of Dry Creek. The hours bled into one another as Ella kept vigil on the porch, a single lantern casting a warm, golden glow on the two of them. The world outside fell silent, the way small western towns always did after the sun dipped below the horizon. There were no rumbling wagons, no distant voices, just the lonely sound of the wind sweeping across the open plains. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to drift into the life she'd once dreamed of, a life where Luke was here, fixing the fence at sunrise, where she tended a small garden bursting with life, where their home was filled with nothing louder than laughter. It was a simple, beautiful dream, but the quiet didn't stay peaceful for long. Luke stirred, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. Ella, don't be frightened. But I didn't come back alone. She leaned in closer, her heart starting to beat a little faster. What do you mean? Luke. Who's with you? He struggled to find the words, his eyes fluttering open with immense effort. They were folks I tried to help, good people, and they were folks who didn't take kindly to it. He swallowed, a painful, difficult motion. I left that trouble behind me, or at least, I thought I did. Ella's hands trembled slightly, but her voice was firm when she replied. You're here now. That's all that matters. His gaze softened, the familiar warmth returning to his eyes, the look he always gave her when he believed in her strength more than his own. You waited for me, he whispered, a sound filled with awe and relief. A tired smile touched her lips, tears welling in her eyes. Always, just after midnight, when the world had settled into its deepest quiet, a soft, deliberate knock echoed from the front door. Ella straightened instantly, every nerve on high alert. Beside her, Luke shifted, a low groan of unease escaping his lips. Don't answer it, he murmured, his voice urgent. But before she could react, a calm, steady voice called from the other side of the door. Ma'am, my name's Marshall Rowan Hayes. I'm here on peaceful business. Ella exchanged a nervous glance with Luke. His eyes were wide not with fear, but with a sudden, sharp awareness. I'll talk to him, she whispered, moving toward the door. No, Ella, just be careful, he pleaded softly. She opened the door, and thus a crack, peering out into the darkness. A tall, weathered man stood on her porch step. His long coat was covered in the dust of a hard-traveled road, but his posture was straight and respectful. A silver badge on his vest caught the flickering lantern light. I'm not here to intrude, ma'am, the marshal said, his voice even and low. I just need to know if a traveler rode this way recently. Ella could feel Luke's gaze on her back, could almost hear his shallow breathing from the chair. What kind of traveler? She asked, trying to keep her own voice steady. The marshal's expression shifted, his calm eyes searching hers. A man trying to get home, a man who's been through more than most folks could bear. He lowered his voice, a gesture of confidence. I'm not chassing him. I'm trying to make sure he's all right. Ella's heart pounded against her ribs. Why? She breathed. Because someone out there might still be looking for him, the marshal replied grimly, and not with good intentions. Behind her, Luke let out a quiet, shaky breath. He knew the marshal was talking about the same trouble he tried to outrun. Taking a deep breath, Ella stepped aside, opening the door wider to reveal Luke, wrapped in the blanket, resting in the rocking chair. Marshal Hayes nodded slowly, his gaze landing on Luke with a look of recognition and concern. Thought so. I've been tracking his trail not to bring him in, but to shield him from whatever trouble is following him. A small wave of relief washed over Ella, but it was quickly followed by a current of uncertainty. Luke opened his eyes, his voice weak but clear. Marshal, I didn't mean to drag anyone into this. You didn't, he said gently, his focus entirely on Luke. But the kind of folks who don't take kindly to your brand of kindness. They don't let go easy. Ella's throat went dry. Is Luke in danger? The marshal paused, choosing his words carefully. Let's just say the open road behind him ain't empty. Luke tried to push himself up, a surge of protective instinct overriding his exhaustion, but Ella placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. Rest, she told him, her voice a soft command. Please, he exhaled, his body sinking back into the chair. I only wanted to do the right thing, Ella, that's all, and you did, she replied, her voice filled with conviction. You always do. The marshal took a step closer, his hat in his hands. Ma'am, if it's all right with you, I'd like to keep watch outside your home tonight. Nothing loud, nothing troublesome. Just to make sure no uninvited travelers wander through your gate. Ella nodded, a swell of gratitude rising in her chest. Thank you, Marshal. He tipped his hat and walked toward the gate, his figure a dark silhouette against the moonlit yard. The lantern light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. Ella returned to Luke's side, taking his cold hand in both of hers. She squeezed it gently. "Luke," she whispered, her voice low and earnest, "I don't know what happened out there. But whatever comes next, we'll face it together." He managed a fragile smile, his tired eyes meeting hers. "I knew you'd say that." And in the quiet of that tense, warm night, with a lawman standing guard at her gate, Ella held onto Luke's hand and braced herself for the storm she could feel brewing on the horizon. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that someone was still on their trail. And with every passing hour, they were getting closer. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The sky began to pale with the first hint of dawn, brushing a soft, gentle blue along the horizon. Ella had been awake the entire night, sitting right beside Luke. Her hand was wrapped tightly around his, as if letting go for even a second might make him disappear all over again. Luke slept lightly, his breathing still a bit uneven from pure exhaustion, but his face, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, was finally at peace. After years of wandering, of unimaginable hardship, of quiet battles he hadn't yet found the words to speak of, he was finally home. Ella watched over him the same way the old lantern watched over their porch, a steady, warm, and gentle presence against the darkness. A soft hoof step in the yard broke the morning stillness. It was Marshal Rowan Hayes. He had stood guard through the long night and was now walking back toward the porch. He moved slowly, with a quiet respect, as if he didn't want to disturb the fragile calm that had settled over the homestead. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ella simply nodded, her gaze not leaving Luke. "Did anything come through?" she asked, her own voice hushed. "Only the wind," the marshal replied, his tone low and reassuring. "But I can tell you this. The trail behind your home shows signs that someone passed through not too long ago." They didn't stop, but they were close, very close. Ella's breath caught in her throat. Her grip on Luke's hand tightened. But the marshal raised a hand, a gesture of reassurance. "You're safe," he said firmly. "I stayed out there for a reason." Whoever's following Luke didn't dare approach with a lawman's badge watching over this place. Ella let out a shaky breath, her eyes glancing toward Luke's sleeping form. "He's been through enough," she whispered, the words heavy with worrying and love. Marshal Hayes nodded in understanding, his voice kind. "I believe he's a good man, ma'am, a man who tried to help the wrong folks. And a man who, more than anything, deserves the chance to finally rest." As the sun climbed slowly above Dry Creek, casting long shadows across the valley, Luke finally began to stir. His eyes fluttered open, soft and worn, but incredibly focused on one thing, on Ella. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice raspy. A small, tired smile touched her lips. She reached out to touch his cheek. "I told you," she murmured. "I always would." Luke tried to sit up a little straighter in the old rocking chair. Ella was right there, steadying him with both hands, her touch firm yet gentle. "You don't need to explain everything right now," she said softly, anticipating the questions in his eyes. "Don't even try, but when you're ready, I'll be right here to listen." Luke just stared at her for a long, quiet moment. His expression was a mix of overwhelming relief, a touch of disbelief, and an emotion that ran far deeper than simple gratitude. It was the look of a man who had found his way back to his anchor in a stormy sea. "There was a family," Luke began, his voice soft, almost a confession. "A young mother and her boy. They were in deep trouble, all tangled up with a group of men who wanted more from them than they could ever possibly give." Ella listened quietly, not interrupting, her hand resting over his, a silent promise of support. "I couldn't just ride past them, Ella," Luke continued, his voice heavy with the memory. "I just couldn't. So I helped them get away. I got them across safe ground, to a place where they could start over." He paused, his eyes lowering to the worn floorboards of the porch. "But the men who wanted them back, they didn't like being told no. And they've been on my trail ever since." Ella's heart clenched with a mix of fear and pride. You did the right thing, Luke. You did the only thing a good man could do. Maybe, he whispered, the word laced with years of doubt. But helping them meant leaving you here, waiting. And that's the one thing I never wanted to do. She squeezed his hand, trying to pour all of her strength into that simple touch. You came home, she said, her voice unwavering. That's what matters. Nothing else. Just then, the sound of boots on the porch steps announced the marshal's return. He gave a polite, respectful nod. Branson, he said, addressing Luke directly, his voice calm and authoritative. The folks who are following you won't be coming anywhere near Dry Creek. I rode out at first light and sent a message ahead on the wire. You're under official protection now. Luke blinked, his tired mind struggling to process the marshal's words. You did that, for me? He asked, a note of genuine surprise in his voice. Marshal Hayes just gave a slight shrug, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Sometimes a man just deserves a fair chance to start over. It seemed to me you'd earned one. Luke looked down at his own hands, humbled by the kindness of a near stranger. I'd still stay off the main roads for a little while, the marshal added, a piece of practical advice. Let things settle down, but you're safe here in this town. And more importantly, so is she. Ella exhaled slowly, a long, deep breath she felt like she'd been holding for years. The crushing weight in her chest finally began to lift, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. As Marshal Hayes turned to leave, he paused at the edge of the porch. He glanced back at Ella and Luke, sitting there together in the early morning light. For what it's worth, he said, his gaze steady, a man who crosses half the West just to keep a promise he made. Well, that's a man worth believing in. Then he tipped his hat, a final gesture of respect, and rode off toward the rising sun, disappearing into the vast, open land that had once been Luke's prison, but now felt like a promise of freedom. Luke leaned back in the rocking chair, the old wood creaking softly. His eyes, now clear of the weariness and fear, softened as he watched Ella. I don't deserve you, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Ella moved to kneel beside his chair, her hand cradling his, feeling the warmth return to his skin. You deserve rest, she said, her voice gentle but firm. You deserve home. And you deserve someone who knows your heart, even when you can't find the words for it yourself. She reached up and brushed a strand of dust from his hair, a simple, intimate gesture. You're here now, Luke, that's enough. It's more than enough. He swallowed hard, fighting against the tide of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. I kept my word, he whispered, the words catching in his throat. It took years. But I made it back. Ella's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. And I kept mine, she said, her voice just as gentle. I waited. Luke lifted her hand and pressed it to his chest, right over his own steady heartbeat. I'm not leaving again, he promised, his voice now strong and clear. Not ever. Not unless you're riding right beside me. Ella smiled, a small, trembling smile she had held inside for 3 long, lonely years. It was a smile of relief, of joy, of a future she had almost given up on. Then sit here with me, she whispered, taking her place in the chair beside him. Let this be the beginning. Not just the return. Together, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the first true rays of morning spill across the quiet road. It was the same road he had left on all those years ago. The same road that had finally, mercifully, brought him home. The wind brushed softly between them, but for the first time, it carried no fear, no hint of pursuit, only a profound sense of peace. Ella leaned her head against his shoulder, a familiar comfort she thought she'd lost forever. Luke closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of pine and dust, and the undeniable warmth of the home he had fought so hard to return to. And there, on that dusty old porch in the quiet town of Dry Creek, 2 hearts, separated by miles and years of hardship, finally found their rest, together. Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories like this one. We'll see you next time.